Hello there everyone, Matt here with thevirtualinstructor.com, and in this lesson we're going to take a look at using oil pastels to create an image of a landscape. And this image is going to be more of a painterly landscape, of course. We're going to see how oil pastels can be used in more of a painterly way, and we can think about the applications that we make with the oil pastels more like brush strokes. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive into the process. For this drawing, I'll be working with Finalizing oil pastels. These soft oil pastels definitely help you to create a painterly look in your oil pastel images. We're going to start here on orange toned Canson Mitance pastel paper. Now this paper, of course, features two different sides, but each side is distinctly different. The side we're working on is the heavily textured side of the paper. As you can see, as I'm making these initial applications with a dark brown oil pastel, you can see how evident the texture of the paper is here. Now we want to work on the heavily textured side of the paper so we can make multiple layered applications with the oil pastels, and we're guaranteed to have enough tooth or texture of the paper to accept these applications. So once we've lightly and loosely drawn everything out with our dark brown oil pastel, we'll begin the process of adding some of the colors. And we're going to go in here with a bit of light blue initially and just establish the locations of the sky off in the distance. Now for this image, I am working from a photo reference, and I picked up this photo reference from Pixabay and did a little bit of editing to the photo reference as well. If you'd like to follow along using this photo reference, I'll leave a link in the description below this video, and we'll take you over to the lesson on the website at thevirtualinstructor.com, and we'll have the photo reference there for you. Now, over the top of our light blue application, we're going to apply a bit of white, and as we're applying this white, you'll notice that these colors start to blend and mix together, creating a lighter blue. Right now, the white is dominating, but as you'll see later in the process, we'll go back in with a bit more of the light blue and bring more of that blue out in this mixture. For the most part, I'm using vertical strokes here just to create more of a painterly look. Of course, during this process, we're going to be concentrating on pulling out some defined strokes here to give it more of a painterly look. And with our initial applications of the sky in place, now we can go back with that dark brown again and establish the overall shape of the tree in the foreground here. Now we're concentrating on shapes here, so you'll notice that we're not going to really develop details. We're going to allow those details to basically emerge through the relationships between the different values and the colors that we use. And of course, shape is important as well. So we're establishing the basic shapes here early in the process, and we're doing it with a darker color, and we're going to be layering some of those lighter values over the top. These oil pastels layer really nicely, so it's very easy to make opaque applications over the top of applications that you've already made on the surface. Again, providing that you have enough tooth or texture on your paper to allow those multiple layered applications. Now, perhaps you've already noticed that I'm referring to the colors that I'm using in terms of color theory. An example of this is I refer to the light blue as light blue instead of a specific named color. And of course here I'm using a dark brown, and I'm not referring to it as a specific named color. And this is because in this particular line of oil pastels, the colors don't actually have names, they have numbers associated with them. And I think this is actually a good thing, because when it comes to learning how to draw and paint with color, I think it's a good idea to learn how to recognize the colors that you want to include in a painting or drawing, instead of trying to think about colors as their individual names. For example, if you were going to use a color for the leaves on the tree, we're going to use a variety of greens here, but if you were looking for a specific color, like let's say lime peel or something like that, a color that was created and named by a manufacturer, instead of thinking of it in terms of a light yellow green, then that's actually going to hinder you a little bit, because you'll be trying to find an equivalent for lime peel, for example, instead of saying, hey, I need a light yellow green. And speaking of yellow-green, now that we've established some of these darker values, we're ready to start pulling out some of the colors here. So we're going to start here with a yellow-green. Now this is kind of a medium yellow-green, and we're just going to go over the top of our dark brown applications and start to pull out some of those green areas. Now, of course, this is going to be a patient process. Even though the oil pastels give you immediate feedback when you apply the color to the surface, it still requires some patience building up the layers that you need to build up to create more of a looser painterly image like we are here. Now, as we're making these marks, we're considering the brush strokes that we're making. Now, you might be thinking, brush strokes? There aren't any brush strokes. And that's true to a certain extent. We're not using a paintbrush to apply any paint here, but the marks that we make with the oil pastels do resemble those made with heavy applications of oil paint. And these brush strokes that we're making here, which I'm going to call them brush strokes, can tell us a bit about the texture of the objects that we're including and also the form of the objects that we're including in the scene as well. So it's very important to consider the directional strokes that you make with the oil pastels. We can also do other things with the so-called brush strokes. We can create a feeling of movement within the scene, and we can also help to direct a viewer's eye to a specific location, like perhaps a focal point. So you can see now I'm applying quite a bit of a lighter yellow-green over the top of some of our darker applications. So we're basically thinking about different steps of value. Now, value is the darkness or lightness of a color, and value is incredibly important in creating the illusion of light within the scene, the illusion of texture, and of course the illusion of form. So here you can see in this particular image, we started with darker values, then we progressively got a little bit lighter, addressing some of those middle values or midtones, and then we're starting to apply some of those lighter yellow greens in areas on some of the leaves. Now, before we get much further, we'll go ahead and address the trunk of our dominant tree here in the foreground and some of the trunks and branches that we see behind this dominant tree in the foreground. So we're starting here with kind of a reddish brown. This is somewhat of a darker version of burnt sienna. And then over the top, we're applying a very, very dark brown here. This might almost look black, but it's actually a very dark brown to create some of the shadowed areas. And then over the top, we're going to apply a bit of a medium gray here. And again, just as I mentioned before about the directional strokes that we make with the oil pastels, we're going to consider this on the trunk of the tree, of course, because eventually this is going to help to create the illusion of the texture of the bark of the tree. So a bit of yellow ochre, and then it's back with that medium gray again. And we'll continue to build up layers in this area until we have a full range of value, some complexity in the color, and of course the texture that we're after here. A little bit of a lighter yellow, and then again with a very, very dark brown here. And then, of course, we need to fill in some of the spaces in between these trees as well. So it's back with our medium yellow-green here, filling in some of these spaces. And, of course, throughout the process, we're going to continue to develop the range of value as well. Now that we have a basic understanding of the trunks of the trees that are in the immediate middle ground and foreground, we can start to overlap some of our applications over the top of these tree trunks. So here you can see I applied a bit of that dark brown and then that medium yellow-green over the top. And then throughout the process, we're going to return to the trunk of the tree. This tree, of course, is the focal point, so it's going to be the area where we have the most detail. So you can see I'm going back now with a bit of yellow ochre, adding just a bit more complexity to the color. Now, you want to be careful that you don't apply too many layers to the surface where you basically exhaust the tooth or texture of the paper, but this paper is so heavily textured that you really can apply lots and lots and lots of layers till you get to that point. But if you're working on a smoother surface, you're going to notice that you run out of tooth obviously a lot quicker, and you're not going to be able to apply as many applications. And that's one of the reasons why the surface that you work on is so incredibly important. Remember, it is the foundation of your artwork. So we're going to go ahead and apply a bit of that yellow ochre to the branch that extends out, and we're also going to use our darker brown to add a few smaller branches. Now, it can be difficult to create more precise lines with oil pastels, but you can see here I'm using the opposite end of the stick and just using the edge of the stick to create these lines, and that's a little trick to help you create more of a controlled line or more of a defined line with oil pastels, which are otherwise a little bit bulky. Usually the tips get flattened, and they're better used for making bolder marks or larger marks, but you can use that edge there to create some sharp lines as well. Now that I've got a lot of the information about the tree and the tree branches and the leaves in place, now we can go back in with our original light blue and start filling in some of these spaces, basically creating bits of the sky peeking through. Of course, that's going to make our tree appear more realistic and more natural. And it's also going to change the shape of the trees just slightly, giving us the opportunity to make it a bit more interesting. And then, of course, just like we did initially with the sky, we'll go back over the top of it with a bit of white. And of course, that mixes to create our lighter blue. But you can see we've got all different types of blues that are starting to appear in the background just by varying the amount of pressure and the amount of material that we apply to the surface. At this point, you can see just how important these brushstrokes that I mentioned earlier are in the final appearance of the drawing. Although we're not finished with the drawing, not by a long shot, we still are starting to see some of that looser, painterly effect that you can achieve with pastels or oil pastels. Now I'm going to go back in with a white oil pastel and basically just add a little bit more variety to the sky, basically just define the shape of some of the clouds. And then it's back to the leaves of the trees, again applying some of that lighter yellow-green, again just concentrating on creating different areas of different values to create the illusion of space and also the illusion of form. Even though I'm making smaller marks that might resemble those of individual leaves, I'm not really thinking about each collection of leaves as being individual leaves. Instead, I'm thinking of it as just that, a collection of leaves. So it's a good idea when you're working with a bulky material like this to think about the leaves of the trees as being basically a form in itself. Of course, it's made up of smaller units, the leaves, but when we see it from a distance, we kind of see it as its own mass. So these masses are going to have dark areas, light areas, and middle values as well. We'll also apply a bit of yellow ochre to the tree, to the leaves as well. Again, just adding a bit more variety to our color. And then we'll continue overlapping patches of leaves as well and continue adding lighter versions of our yellow-green as well. And you can see as we continue this overlapping process, adding those collections of leaves over the top of the trunks and the branches, we start to create a real sense of depth here, and our tree starts to become a little bit more believable. Now, if you're working with your own set of oil pastels and the yellow-green is not popping quite as much, you can always work to an even lighter version. And you can see here I'm using more of a lime green with quite a bit of white mixed in with it. Of course, I'm not adding the white, but this is a much lighter version of yellow-green. It's almost a neon color, but when it's applied over the top of the more earthy yellow-green, it appears more natural. Now with our dark brown, we'll go ahead and pull up a few more branches that are happening and maybe a few smaller trees that are happening on the right side of the picture plane. Again, just to create a little bit more of an illusion of space there and some added interest. We'll also deepen the shadow on the two dominant trees in the foreground and a few more branches in the background as well with that dark brown. Now you'll notice here as I'm making some of these smaller branches, I'm also somewhat rolling the pastel as I'm making these marks. That's in another way that will help you get a little bit more control over the mark and allows you to create a smaller or skinnier mark with a bulky medium like oil pastels. Then again, you can see I've returned now to our tree, our main focal point here, adding just a bit of a lighter version of a color. This is almost a cream color. And then over the top, we'll add a few more additional collections of leaves, again, creating additional space and, of course, making the tree more interesting in the process as well. Now, some of our branches are much lighter, so I'm using a white pastel stick here to add a few of those smaller white branches as well. And we'll go ahead and put a little bit of color down here in the middle ground for our grassy field here. And you can see this is a very light yellow green. We're going to use this color as a base color. So we'll go ahead and get some of that color in place. And then at this point, I see that I need to go back and add a little bit more variety to the tree here. So in this case, I'm using a darker blue. This is very similar to an ultramarine, maybe slightly darker than a regular ultramarine. And I'm going to go into some of the shadowed areas and add a little bit of color to those shadowed areas. They just seemed a little bit flat. I wanted to make them pop a little bit more with color. And of course, we can do this when we're dealing with green. We can use yellow to make some of our highlights feel a little bit lighter in value and also a little bit warmer. And we can add blue to make our shadows feel a little bit cooler and maybe slightly darker as well, because we mix green obviously by combining blue and yellow. So yellow being the warmer of the two colors and also lighter in value naturally, then that makes sense to use it for the highlighted areas. And then of course, blue being the cooler and darker version of the two colors that are mixed to make green, it makes sense to use that in the shadowed areas as well. Now, as we work our way down to the foreground here, work our way down lower on the picture plane, obviously, we're going to incorporate more greens here. We want to have greater contrast as we work towards the viewer. Typically, when we're seeing things that are closer to us, we're going to see greater contrast. So our darks are going to be darker, our lights are going to be lighter. But as we go back into space, that value relationship is muted to a certain degree. So it's not quite as strong. The contrast is not quite as strong. So you can see here in the foreground, I'm using both very, very light greens and also dark greens, warmer greens and cooler greens, and I'm also pulling in a little bit of burnt sienna as well. Again, just to add as much variety and contrast as we possibly can have here in the foreground. Now you can see initially our marks are very, very loose. We're going to refine them a little bit as we continue to develop this area, but for now we're just getting colors down on the surface. We'll also add some peaks of some lighter yellow green here in the background. We want to think about our drawing or painting in totality, so that's why we're going to continue going back to areas that we've already addressed and just refine them further as we get more information on the surface. Now, at this point, I'm going to deviate from the photo reference, and I've decided to add a bit of information about some flowers here. So I'm adding some flowers to the field off in the distance, and I'm going to pull these collections of flowers closer to the viewer into the foreground, and that will just help to guide the viewer's eye, hopefully, to the focal point, which of course is the tree. It's also going to help to create a little bit more of that illusion of space within the scene, because we can deal with scale. So we can have these smaller flowers off in the distance, and as we get closer to the viewer, we see a little bit more detail, and of course the flowers are a little bit larger, and of course that will help to encourage the illusion of space. So as we work a little bit closer, our marks are going to get a little bit larger with the white pastel. Now, as we're making these marks, you want to make sure that you're creating quite a bit of variety here, so you don't want to get too mechanical with your applications, which means that all of the shapes of the flowers are exactly the same and there's not a lot of variation in where they're positioned. So you want to make sure that there's a lot of variety happening there with your groupings of the flowers. And speaking of variety, you can see I'm adding quite a bit of variety of different greens here around the flowers as well. Of course, we're going to see more detail, so that means again more variety in the foreground. So I'm using a bit of yellow to create some of the highlights. Here a bit of yellow ochre is added on the right side of the picture plane, but also some cooler greens, using some of those blue greens in areas as well. And we can also intensify some of the shadows in between some of the grasses here in the foreground with a bit of that darker blue that we used for some of the shadowed areas in the trees as well. And of course, this helps to tie the entire image together. We wouldn't want to just have those blues showing up in areas of the trees. We'd want that to be consistent throughout the image. Of course, that's going to encourage harmony and unity within the piece as well. So to tone down some of these blues in the foreground though, and make them a little bit more of maybe some subtle undertones, we're going to apply a bit of a blue-green over the top, and then of course we're going to add a little bit of a patch of some light filtering through here. So lighter yellow greens, and of course a bit of yellow is added here as well. We'll also add a bit more variety to the greens that we see here in the middle ground. As we go off in the distance, though, we're going to see less variety, of course, and less contrast as well. So light is hitting that hillside back there and creating a nice, fairly solid application, or a fairly solid field of light yellow-green. But as we work here to the foreground, we see, of course, more definition and more variety. I am going to use this lighter yellow, though, to pull out a little bit more variety in this distant field, although it's going to be very subtle. So you can see a strong mark is added here. This is going to give just a little bit more of an impression of strong light filtering through, and then another strong streak is added here on the side of the hill as well. So still very similar, but just a little bit of variety. And now we're ready to pull everything together and add our finishing touches. So we're going to grab a bit of red here. And I know this sounds maybe a little bit of a strange choice, but the red is actually going to stand out in contrast against the green because it's a complementary color to green. Of course, red is directly across from green on the color wheel. So I'm adding just a hint of red to areas of the trunk and branch of the tree, or branches of the tree. And then I'm going back over the top of it with that dark brown and just toning it down just a little bit. So those bits of red that are going to peek through in the final image are subtle, but still noticeable. So as you can see here with the application of the dark brown, we still see peaks of that red showing through, but it feels a bit more natural once it is toned down with the dark brown. And then of course, once these final applications are made, our image of a landscape completed with oil pastels with a more painterly approach is now complete. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you were able to pick up a couple of things here and there. If you're new to the channel, I encourage you to subscribe. We cover a broad variety of drawing and painting, mediums, and subjects here on this channel. If you'd like to check out 3 of our course videos and ebooks for free, you can do so. I'll leave a link in the description below this video. You can go check that out. And if you want to take your drawing and painting to another level, you can check out our comprehensive membership program, which includes tons of video courses on drawing and painting, weekly live lessons, weekly critiques as part of the Members Minute, and a year-long curriculum for visual arts teachers. I'll leave a link to our membership program below this video as well. Thanks again for watching, and as always, I wish you all the very best in your artistic success.